For our demo tonight, I'm going to get started with it a little bit, and then Ray Hamilton, this nice young gentleman in the back, is going to help me out. And I had agreed to do a demo on green wood turning a while back because this time of the year, a lot of times trees blow down either on your property or the neighbor's property, or you have something like that. And it's a lot of fun to turn green wood if you've never done that before. You get some great big chips flying out, and it's just a lot of fun, easier than the dried wood. This is a book that I purchased over at Woodcraft in Iowa City, and it's turning green wood, and it has an awful lot of information in here, not just about turning green wood, but also how you can cut wood and get different bowls out of it, or different items, vases. It has a lot of information about how to use your chainsaw on the wood and get whatever you want out of it. So if any of you are interested in this, you can take a picture of this and go over to the Woodcraft show and store and get that too. And we do get a 10% discount at the store over there in Iowa City. This is like a pretty gnarly piece of wood, doesn't it? But it's something like this. You can take, my sister had a storm over in Iowa City and lost some apple trees, and she gave me this piece. But see, it has a crotch right here, two branches coming out of it, and you don't know exactly what it's going to be like with the grain on the inside. But this is green wood, and you can just pick this up like this, practice with it. If you don't have any good luck, just throw it away. If it turns out to be something you like, then you got something good. But that's a real advantage of turning green wood. You don't have to invest a lot of money or time in it. And you can find out a lot about grain in the wood. You always want to make sure that you take the pith out of the wood. The small bowl that I had over here, the pith was about a 1/16 of an inch from the edge. And of course, the crack went right to it. So that's the reason we usually recommend that when you're doing any wood cutting or wood turning, that you remove the pith from your object. And the pith, of course, is not always the center, but it should be close to the center on each end. But you have to pay attention to that because it may be here at one end and then down here at the other end. To cut up pieces of wood, the green wood, I use my bandsaw. And one of the things that I always recommend if you're using a bandsaw and wood, round wood, is the use of a sled. This is one that we have in the back here for our bandsaw. You can lay the log in here and then run it through your bandsaw. If you have never tried running a round log through a bandsaw and want to get the stuff scared out of you, just put a log through there and it'll start spinning as soon as it catches, and you'll break your blade probably, or have to change your underwear or do something like that. So a device like this is very, very helpful, and we do have this here at the club. If you don't have something like this in your shop, you can make a sled out of wood, and this is just goes in my bandsaw. And I put a little screw on the end, so you can put your log in here. The screw will hold it, keep it from rotating. If you're going to cut the log off long ways, or if you want to rip it, cut it this way, you can put the log down there, and then you just slide this through. The advantage is then you attach the log or the piece of wood firmly to your sled, and then the sled takes it through. If you don't do that and you're pushing it through the bandsaw, it can wiggle, it can twist, and some things can happen that aren't very nice. So I always recommend using some kind of a sled if you have any round wood through your bandsaw. We do have this also in the back for the bandsaw if you want to use that, and it's got directions on how to use it too. Some people have used it the wrong way occasionally. I won't mention any names, but we use that in the back, and it works very, very well with our bandsaw. A bandsaw is an excellent item to use when you're cutting green wood. Usually they recommend 3 teeth per inch and at least a 1/2 inch bandsaw blade, the width. And I think that's what we have back here, isn't it? Pardon me? 5 teeth? Okay. 3 to 5. The greener the wood, the bigger the less teeth you should have because it takes more time to get the sawdust out. The other nice thing about turning green wood, all you really need to do that is a gouge, a bowl gouge like this. You don't need a lot of fancy other equipment. You can get your piece on the lathe and you can turn a lot with just your bowl gouge. You don't have to buy a lot of other equipment to get started on that. So if you're a new wood turner and want to practice with some pieces of wood, that's a good way to get started. Well, I think I've said about everything I can say, everything I know. And Ray knows 100 more times more than what I do, and he's done a lot of bowls. This is something he is up here in front, and Ray will turn it over to you.
Okay. Take that.
Sure.
That kicks in. I appreciate it. Oh, you did a nice job. Thanks, Denny. Yeah, am I coming through okay? Great. So, I've turned mostly green wood, probably 95% for a decade and a half. I think what got into it, I had actually purchased the club's, one of the first lathes the club had for the demo here, a Jet 16-inch. I think the club moved up to a bigger lathe. And but at a family place, we had like several downed walnuts. It had been in our family since the 1880s, and there were trees that were down, and I had to figure out how to turn and how to deal with all that wood. So I ended up spending a couple of months at the neighbor's shop and made a lathe out of a rear end of a Mustang. And I'm not a metal person, believe me, but I got it together. It's a hefty old thing, and I ended up green turning blanks all winter. So at any rate, green turning, to me, you could also say it really is turning wet wood. I mean, it's green turning is wet turning. The wood is wet. And so the whole issue, whether you're talking about when you got a log or all the way to the finished product, is how do you dry that? How do you let it dry? How do you dry it so that you don't get cracking? And to me, it's a matter of controlled drying, even drying, but taking into account that wood is going to lose moisture through the long grain more than the side grain. So I think maybe the easiest way to do this is just kind of, I'll describe sort of how I do it from the log right on through. And by the way, I'm happy to have input, questions, comments. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Are there any cat lovers here? Sorry about that. So so if anybody's got commentary or question, raise your hand. If I don't see you, shout or throw something at me, and I'd like to have some feedback, of course. I think everybody would. So when I get wood that's, let's say freshly down, although as we'll see here, it could be down for a while, a year or two even, and still be wet. I like to get as big of a piece as possible, as long as possible. Water's going to leave that piece of wood through the long grains, and you can let that happen. You can cut it off and go to get to a good spot in the log or whatever branch and be okay. So I just like to have it as long as possible. And I've gone and picked up pieces that are 8 or 10 feet long logs, and just so I'll get the log or the branch and just store it in the shade. In a cool spot, in the woods, in the shade, something like that, where it's not going to get heated up and dry too quickly out the ends. And then when I'm ready to turn, I will end up going to that log, and the log can, are we back to where this shows? Yeah, there we go. you can go back and maybe the end of your log is going to look like that. It's dried out and split. Even if you can coat it, but if you got a whole log, you don't have to worry about it. But this came down with the derecho, and it was sitting out, and I just before I came here, I cut it off to just see how far that split went, and it's just 1.5 inches, and it's not split here. So basically, I would go and cut back a little bit to get away from the cracks, maybe a little bit more just in case there's some microscopic ones you don't see. Cut off the other end. Then that piece is going to go in the shop right then. I'm going to go and take it in, or that day, but preferably before that, because it'll start losing moisture kind of quickly. And then I'll turn my piece to completion at that time. And if it's partly done on the lathe and it's time for dinner, I'm not going to go get dinner. I'm going to go and finish it all. And that's because as you're turning it, you're losing moisture. It's got water coming out of it, kind of splatter in your face and stuff like that. And even with regular wood, when you turn it, it will relieve some tensions and change just a little bit. Green wood can start changing shape and actually doing a little bit of cracking too as you turn it. So, I don't think it's a good idea to turn it part way and then kind of save it and do some the next day. If it changes shape and you have part of it turned, you've got to go redo it and all that. So I just don't want to put up with that. So I think that the other, one thing you can do and is from that log or whatever, you can cut it off, put it on the lathe, and then turn it and leave it thick. And with bowls, they say, and basically you can leave it in this thick form, let it dry, and we'll talk about drying. This will undergo a little bit of change of shape and everything naturally. That just happens when it dries. Then you can pick it up later when it's all dry, put it on the lathe and turn it if you want it to be all nice and even. At that point, it isn't green turning. You've got a dry piece. But so you can do that. Turn the green piece down thick, let it dry, and then go through the shape change and come back and finish it later. Most of mine, I don't do that anymore. I just turn them to completion. Yes?
How long do you let it dry, Ray?
How long do you let it dry? You can use a moisture meter. I never do. On pretty much all this stuff, I put it in a condition that I know it's going to dry, and we'll talk about that. And I'm just not in a hurry to get back. So, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 months later, 6 months later, a year later, I'll turn it in a piece like that. And the same thing with the finished piece. I'll just let it dry and not be in a big hurry to finish.
Do you use any other kind of equipment, like some people like microwaves or anything like that to speed up the drying?
Okay, the question is, do you use any, you've got the speaker there. So did everybody hear that? Do you use any other kind of equipment? So I don't much, although people do. Okay, let's suppose that, just to back up a little bit, let's suppose I've turned this piece of wood and I take off my lathe and okay, so it's what do we do with it? How it's wet, and I'll tell you what, if you leave it out just in your house or in the room, an air conditioner heated place, it's quite likely to warp, change, and it can split that same day or by the next day even, right down the side. My very first one, I know, because my first one I did, it did that. And so what I do myself is I want to, first of all, Steve pointed this out to me a long time ago, that you want to have your piece turn evenly, even thickness, and even right around to the, right around to the bottom and so on. But even then, you can get disproportionate water loss through end grain versus side grain. So part of this, if you just leave it sit, part of it's going to lose on the thinner, on the end grain, and it won't on the other. That's going to harden. This other one then is going to be a day or two or a week or two later, whatever it is, it's going to dry and it's going to change and it's going to crack the part that's already dry. So you don't want that to happen. So I commonly will, it's a matter of slowing down, for me, slowing down drying on the end grain. I'll typically take this bowl that's wet now, and I put it in a cardboard box with a hole in the bottom, and I put the wet shavings on top of the bowl, and especially on the end grain, here and here. I'll pack it up there pretty heavy. And I might even leave it just a little bit open there. And it's got a little hole there so it can get some air through. And then I think more importantly is I'm not going to leave this in the heated or air-conditioned home. Typically I've always had a place outside, a shed, a outdoor basement room, something that might be a little damp and moist. It might be some spiders or something, that kind of place. I'll put it in there so that it has time to dry to that given somewhat higher humidity than we'd have in our homes and so on. I just let that sit for a month or two. You could probably do it maybe not as long, or 2-3 months, and then that's still a little bit humid, so by that time this is undergone, it's dried fairly well, but I'll take it and put it up in the garage that's in the sunlight and warm, and just let it air dry there, and I'll leave it in the same box, because by then all the shavings are dry and everything, but it's been a nice even drying process. So that's what I do.
So I noticed you you have a thinner stem. Is that something that you parted off after you kind of got it to the final shape?
That's a good question. When I've turned this, it's on the lathe. Before I take it off, I always make this part that you're talking about, and I always leave room, try to leave room for it. I squeak it lots of times, but try to leave room and design the bottom of this so I can make a parting cut here. And that's so that the bottom isn't real thick, and it might take 2 weeks longer to dry, and again, then that bottom will crack, and that crack will carry right up into your piece. So that's an automatic trouble spot if you got a thick bottom. That crack isn't gonna, that's gonna dry, it isn't gonna stop, where you think it should. So I make this parting cut here, but I leave it there because I like to sand and finish with this grip. Yeah, that's a good question. Mm-hmm. Any questions up to that point? Then we'll talk about different ways to dry differently. Any questions on this or comments?
I assume since you said you were sanding, or you like to keep that for sand, you don't finish it until it's dry.
Yeah, most of the stuff I mean, if you try to sand, if it's fairly fresh and fairly wet, the sandpaper just gums up immediately, and you just don't make any. I don't make any headway on it. I think in pieces, it's certainly possible that some pieces, some logs that I've had for 3 or 4 years, there is a bit of a drying or some other characteristics that may allow you to get some sanding on the lathe, but essentially not. So this is sand. This is turned. That's just how I turn it on the lathe right there, with the tools, no sanding. And so then I let it dry. Then I'll come back at some other time and sand and finish it. So, and if you want to take a look, these, I'll put it up here too. These others are, it's the same sort of deal there. Yeah, there is a little undercut in that one on the foot, and it's the same thing. These are all tool turned and right off the lathe.
That one that's in your right hand?
Yes.
That looks like it's warped. So when you have that, you go ahead and just put it back on the lathe and sand it and leave it that way as
Yeah.
just more character for the bowl kind of thing?
Yeah, right. In fact, that's a good point. You can and should look at all of these, and on a bowl this size, it's pretty common to have, it'll elongate on the long axis and narrow down. It might be easily 3/4 of an inch difference in dimensions. And in the bigger bowls I've got, it's an inch, inch and a quarter difference in dimension one way and the other because of the change in the shape. So, and if you don't like that, then again, I'll just go back to you can do this. You leave it thick, and it'll go through that warp and change, and then you can turn it and get a nice, even, symmetrical bowl if that's important. But so all of these, if you look at them, they definitely are altered in their shape. And then, this same thing. I've got this just so it travels well and I don't bark up the edges. But that has an undercut also on it. And I don't like to glue feet on and do all that. If you get a log and have lots of wood, I just want to make sure I have enough room that I can have a foot that's part of the piece, and I don't monkey around at all with having to grab it, later. Yes.
How do you mount it on the lathe? A piece of log?
Well, that's a good question. He asks, how do I mount it on the lathe after it's dried, and you want to.
Oh, right, the first time when you first get the piece.
Oh, okay. When you first have the piece of wood, well, typically I do on vases and bowls. I almost always go between centers. Is that what you're asking? Yeah, I usually go between centers and then end up. You want to do that just to get your foot, but I end up shaping it up and sometimes going too far even between centers, but eventually get where you've got your foot turned and I tend to shape up the bowl so I can see what's going on and all of this. Yeah, you don't know what's in any of the wood we've got, and you have to make some adaptations. But at any rate, then flip it around and mount it in the chuck. Now I'll have to note I've got it down. The other thing is I cut all of my logs and everything with a chainsaw, and we could do an outside thing sometime, but I'm just real precise when I'm cutting the log in two lengthwise, and I'm studying where do I want to cut it in two. What do I want for the piece I'm going to be turning? Is there some symmetry? Are there colors or patterns? Are there branches that maybe I want out of the way or in the way, and all that. And then I'm pretty careful. I'll measure from either the center or measure from the bark down where I want to make my cut, and I'll do that same measurement on this side, and then draw a line this way, and then make a cut here where I want to go, maybe 1/4 of an inch, over here where I've got it marked 1/4 of an inch, then I'll tie the two together 1/4 of an inch, and here, so I've got it all nicely marked up. Then I'll start working on each of those cuts, and I would say I'm within a 1/16th of an inch of where I want to be after doing all that. And so sometimes in those cases, I've just, because I know where I want that foot and where the axis of it is going to be, I'll mount that right on a plate. I did that a lot early on, just for quick and secure, and kind of you can screw it in and start working right away with a lot of strength. And I don't like a piece coming off. I won't accept that I do that. So I kind of go the extra step to make sure that that never happens. It's just a nuisance to have something kind of nice and then it comes loose, and then you have to deal with trying to get it back right or returning it. That's such a pain in the rear that I don't like it. So any questions up to here, and we'll talk about other drying issues. Yeah?
Are there any kinds of turnings that require use of wet wood?
Are there any kinds of turnings that require the use of wet wood?
For example, we had one demonstration, a person turned a hat and got the brim and that kind of stuff. Are there any other types of turnings that require the use of wet wood versus dry?
Yeah, that's a good example of what wet wood will do. I was mentioning I saw him turn, I think, at the Louisville National Seminar, and went up and looked at his tools and everything afterwards. And there's enough flexibility that he seemed to be kind of recklessly using his gouge, but the piece flexed enough that it was working okay for him. But any requirements for that? Maybe someone else has a thought on that.
Something a friend of mine from Lloyd made from green wood, from wet wood. And I think he just took the branch and turned it, like you said, between centers. And then this is very thin right here at the top, if you want to show that.
Mm-hmm.
And some people, when they make things like this too, they'll put a light on the side so they can see what the thickness of the wood is. And they have a picture of that here in the front of the book too. The brighter the light is, of course, then the thinner the wood is. So then you just keep taking it down little by little until you get it exactly where you want it. Or break it.
I think Osage, a lot of people do that. Osage on edge.
Oh,
Like to do it wet because it's so hard.
okay, there's a comment then that people like to do Osage orange because it's so darn hard. So the one advantage is that, and the one pleasant part of it is, it's sort of softer and smoother rather than using dry wood that feels just more brittle in the turning. So it seems like you can slice through it and the tools move through it nicer. It's pretty comfortable.
Ray, how do you deal with tear out when it's on the side grain, or and grain, I guess? Because it's usually, when it's green, it's a lot more prone in that section to be.
I'm not so sure about that because, I mean, it's green, and part of tear out is wood pulling out wood, and I think there might be a little more smoothness or something cutting through that same zone when it's green, and you may get a greener, smoother cut there possibly even.
So is it just kind of your tool work that makes, because I know when I do the green, and it could be because I'm sanding it while it's still green, it packs it right in that line of the and grain, and so you could see that it's fuzzy versus the rest of it is nice and smooth.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure about that. I have to think on that. But I as far as the roughness and stuff, I mean, these. there's enough change that happens with the grain in the drying process that, you know, a little tear out or fuzziness is just going to come out with the first sanding you do. When you take a look at this oak, for example, when it dries, the summer and winter grain dry differently, and you'll actually get a little bumpiness from the different grain here. So I think by the time you get all that sanded out, any little tear out is gonna, you know, be okay.
That's the one I was talking about.
Oh, now that one,
Because it's,
Oh.
it's the soft wood.
okay. So yeah, now this is something that happens with. This is more of an issue to me, something that happens with the natural edge. As I'm coming down on this, it's hard enough to get this shape and get some smoothness to it. And so I'm usually making multiple passes, just taking a little bit off. And if I get right down to where I'm just about where I want the thickness, and I just about have it right, but I have a little gouging in here on that process. If it is deemed by me to be, look at, I like the shape, I like where I'm at, I'm going to leave that there and take that out with sanding. That's more, I think, with the natural edge. Because, again, the green wood, I'm not going to come back on this green piece because that's there. I'm not, if I try to take that out, it's going to gouge, it's going to change the shape in the rest of the, that I already have made. I'm not going to come back out here and start here to make a swipe all the way across there, because this will have changed shape already. I'd come back out here and be bouncing around and then get down to here, and if we think that little gouge is bad, it's like we just really messed it up. So
So essentially, you just wait till it dries and send it out.
that particular, something like that, because that was done on like a final pass.
When you talk about sanding it, then are you sanding it on the lathe, or are you sanding it
No.
with
you-
like a drill and a pad?
On all the ones I do, because they're out of shape, you cannot sand it on the lathe.
Right.
Now, vases, you sort of can, if you've done it in this manner, but it might be hit and miss. They still go out of shape, but they're a little more forgiving in the way you hold the sandpaper. But essentially, it's all, I'll call it hand sanding, but I don't like to sand, and I don't do that much hand sanding. I just use sanders that will do the job. Yeah. So on the question earlier was then, are there other ways to dry or, so I think, and then actually Steve might weigh in on this, but folks will do things to try to stabilize the position and reduce cracking, stabilize the chemistry of the wood and try to reduce cracking and maybe change the rate of drying. Boiling is one thing. I've never boiled. So this is after I've turned it and it's all wet. I got to do something with it. Got to dry it. There's boiling. You can freeze it. And Steve, he can talk more about it, but it described their, this is probably at a cellular level, rupturing some of the water holding components of the wood, and so that may be a way to reduce shape change and cracking. The other one was Jake was in the club here 5, 6, 7 years ago, and he really kind of pushed drying with alcohol. And now alcohol is combustible. It's not safe. Don't use it in your shop. But he promoted the use of denatured alcohol and putting the finished product in the alcohol. And I've done that, a few dozen times just to try it out. and I've left it in like for a day or day and a half, something like that. And there's no question the alcohol does apparently displace the water, and so the bowl has, you know, more alcohol in it, less water, and so that when you take it out, that alcohol dries just like that quickly, and so you sort of had a quick dry without allowing it to change shape and crack and so on. And it does that. I've done it, and it works. Yeah.
When you're working with green wood, does the speed make a difference? Like, are you starting out?
The speed of turning.
Yeah, are you starting slowly, or because it's green, you don't want it to tear out as much? Or are you actually starting a little faster?
I think it's the same. No, it's no slower at all. It's a little bit easier turning, so I think, you know, you could probably get to a little faster speed sooner. I don't think speed isn't really an issue, or at least I still stay in a certain zone that is comfortable. And I never really look at the speed, but I don't think there's I don't notice a notable issue with the speed either way, other than the green turning a little smoother, and I think you might be able to go faster, a little quicker. So, anything else on that, on types of drying or way to dry? I guess we covered that. The other thing is, okay, if you've got this log, you've got your green piece of wood, so, you know, you don't want to let it dry too quickly because it'll start splitting, and then, you know, instead of, you know, if you got well, it can crack in significantly such that you don't have a very big piece if it goes too far. But on the other hand, if you leave it for a long time within a log form, or want to seal the edges to slow down the healing or something, it is going to, of course, decay. You know, it's wet, so you immediately start a breakdown or decay process, and you can have some spalting take place. If it goes on long enough, for a few years, it's going to get punky. So I'm not saying that's bad, but you don't want to seal up your finished piece totally at all. You've got to let it dry. You just want it to dry slowly. And at the same time, you know, you want to be tuned in to leaving it too long. So I was demonstrating kind of annually up at the fall art tour in Wisconsin. The daughter and son-in-law do pottery up there. This has been a decade ago. And I had to get demo pieces I'd forgotten, and I needed just some little pieces to turn for the demonstration for the 3 days. I'd stay in the building, and it was kind of fun. I just turned all the time. People would come back and chat, and I'd sell some stuff. But I went out, it was about dusk, and I went out I knew there were some logs down. There was a cherry tree there, so I went and quick got some pieces out of it and turned up there. And then I also turned out of that tree. And so this is for example, this is a year one turning that I did, you know, a few weeks after that out of that log. Okay? Tree had been down that year. The next year I was going up there, and I thought, I did do littler things up there. I thought, I'm going to get some more wood out of that same tree. So I went out in the woods, and the tree is not under cover or anything. It's not resting all the way on the ground, you know, but it's shaded, woodland, but it's rain and everything else. So year two, I turned this piece out of it. You can see it's the same tree. It's got this really kind of fantastic pattern. It's growing into it. And you can see the sapwood is a little bit darker color. The heartwood also just a little bit darker, but actually, I kind of like it, that year two one. Did the same thing third year. Went out the same tree. Got some more out of the same tree. You can see the pattern in there again. It's the same tree. So it's still turnable. The sapwood is lighter yet. There is a little change in the structure of the heartwood. Some of the growth rings seem to be, I guess, a little faded out. But again, actually, kind of a nice color there. Year 4. So now the sapwood is really getting punky. A lot of it wasn't good. I left some of the punky sapwood in there, and actually these pieces kind of had that cruddy, you know, I did the green turning and got home and left it out. And the next year or so I looked at them. I kind of put them aside because they had that punky stuff in it, but actually I finished some of these things, and these just disappeared at the sales just immediately, you know, so it was a desirable thing. And then this must be year 5. Year 5, there's just a lot more decay, but there's still, and almost essentially no sapwood. You couldn't really use sapwood, and the heartwood is also changing structure. There's kind of a little starts of a little bit of punkiness in there. You can't feel it or anything, but you can see there's breakdown that's taking place with the fungal decay. Next year, year 6, still kind of pretty. Year 7, I went out then and I could hardly find any wood. The heartwood was punky. I found a few small pieces that had non-punky heartwood, and that's the way it turned out in year 7. So in the log form, and there is dampness still. This I consider green turned. I didn't check the moisture on them, but it's green. You can tell they're damp, and I think the fungus itself captures some of that moisture. And
Right. How long did you leave them out before you sanded and put the finish on?
So most of these are in that, I put them in that moist, dampish area for a couple of months, then out somewhere else where it's warm, either in the home or up in the garage if it's, you know, warm, and heated up there and just let them dry out. So I don't know the earliest you could go and do that. I guess you'd check it with a moisture meter or trial and error, but a lot of these I wouldn't finish for 6 months or a year or 2. Yeah.
Ray, are there any differences between species of wood as far as how they react after drying out or whatever?
Well, I would say for sure, just on a little different measurement there, and that is a rate of decay. Like American elm and hackberry, which are cousins, are hard, solid, very pretty grained woods. That first year they're down, but you know, 2-3 years later, you know, they can be, you know, decayed and punky and breaking down a lot really quickly. But as far as yeah.
Are there any species that you recommend not turning in wet form, or are there species that you would recommend to try and find, or that are really great for wet turning?
I think it's kind of the same. I pick on the same species, dry and wet, I would say. You know, in this area, I mean, you know, cherry, walnut, hard and soft maple, elm, hackberry, all those are pretty good. Oak, I don't do too much. A lot of people don't, but I saw some nice pattern there. But I think those are the ones I like, and they're locally common. All these woods are common, and I turn them all down, so I don't cut any trees down to turn. It's all downed wood. And you can pick out you were asking before, you know, why do green turning? Well, there is that smoothness of the turning, but the other thing is you can look at lots of wood and pick out color and patterns and things like that, and that's what I'm looking for. I like to shop in woods and check it out and pick out what I want. Any other questions? Yes.
Have you ever had the turning you're doing crack or split while you're doing the turning?
Have I ever had the
Had the wood crack or split while you're doing the turning? Is that
well,
an issue?
not because it was green. Yeah, and I was doing some turning of just kind of odd wood and stuff like that, trying to keep up with some of the folks that were coming in with gnarly stuff and all that. And I had a hackberry bowl. It was still pretty big. It had a deficit through it, a little thing that I didn't think was a problem. And this is still heavy, wet, and I had a Powermatic just like this, and I'm turning it, and the part of this piece came off, and the lathe was, bouncing around because it was irregular. I had to stay out of the way of this thing because it was scaring me to pieces, but I had to turn it off. And I reached over like this and to turn off the lathe, and I hit the rheostat and it speeded it up. Boom, boom, boom. And I'm not kidding you, that whole piece came and hit me in the shoulder, and I didn't get hit in the head or knocked out, but I don't recall going down. I was on the ground so fast, I got just immediately knocked down to the ground. But that wasn't wet wood. It was just bad judgment, I guess, on my part. And then since that time, I do have a different turn-off, and especially for this side of the lathe for hollowing, that I've got a big turn-off plate here that I keep my thigh on, so if anything goes on, I can lean right into it and turn it off. That's all the bad tales I have right now. Most of the experiences have been good. I think that covers it.
Ray, one thing that I've done, which is kind of fascinating to me, but is to get a digital scale and then weigh it every day. And then I plot it out, and it's interesting to see the weight come down. And when it comes down, it's the same weight day after day, then you know you're there. It's fun to do that.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.